fun little end to the day. Thank you for staying with us. As Kit mentioned, I'll be talking to you about untranslatable words and specifically how we can learn about different cultures and languages through them. So I want to start out by saying I love the internet. I think many of you do too. It's how we're all able to work here. It's how we're able to work remotely. But I think even more empowering is the internet's ability to take people from literally across the world, millions of miles away, and bring them together. It allows us to experience different cultures from across different continents and bring them right to our doorstep or to our laptop in this case. Many of us are very lucky to be able to do this in real time in the physical world by traveling from country to country, but as you guys know, this is a big privilege of ours and not everyone has access to these new cultures to open their minds. And so one of the ways that I think we're able to further accomplish that, I've realized, is through untranslatable words. I feel like there are these little looking glasses into different cultures that maybe we didn't know existed, or specific parts of those cultures that were just not part of our reality beforehand. So around a year ago, I decided to really get even deeper into this world of untranslatables, and I was learning to code over the last year or two, and I decided to enter this 24-hour startup challenge. In this challenge, I decided to create a project called Unoya. Unoya itself is one of these untranslatable words. It's one of my favorites. It means basically a well mind or beautiful thinking. It comes from a Greek origin. And initially, I posed part of this challenge, and it was live streamed on Twitch. So it was, all about this approach to connectivity. People were up on Twitch helping me build the platform or giving me advice. We crowdsourced the submissions to around 100, just over 100 different untranslatable words. And since then, it's grown to over 500, which is cool, across over 50 languages, and where people from over 150 countries have actually now used Unoya to explore and learn a little bit more. But this talk is not about Unoya, but it's about this concept of untranslatable words and what we can learn from them. And I hope that by the end of it, you guys will also have a deep fascination with these words and what we can learn from them. So what are untranslatable words? I mean, they're pretty straightforward. They're words that exist in one language, but don't have a direct translation in other languages. And so when you really think about the origin or why we have untranslatable words, it's really when someone can't express themselves with a given set of words in their particular language. And when that happens, you come up with your own. And we've all come up with our own words, but when does that really enter the normalcy of a given language? It happens when the frequency of experience is high enough. But one thing that's so interesting about untranslatables is that the frequency has to be high enough in that language, but not others, which means you're really getting to see some very intricate, unique part of that particular culture that's present there, but not elsewhere. And so a couple examples of this. We all know in Japanese, bowing is a very precise form or precise part of their culture. So they have a suite of words that is directly related to just the different degrees of bowing. In Albania, there's not one mustache, but actually 27 different words for mustache. And the Inuit, based on where they live and their physical conditions, have almost like a micro-language for snow. So those are some fun little facts. And to kind of add on to that, I wanted to share some of my favorite untranslatable words to give you a sense of why I love them so much. So everyone, I think most people in this room are familiar with the word Nintendo and the Japanese technology company. That is actually also an untranslatable word from Japanese, which means essentially leave luck to heaven, or basically to leave your fortune in the hands of fate. Another one that I really love, probably gonna butcher some of the pronunciations, is Abendroh, which is a German word, which basically is a term for the color of the sun when it's setting. I think that's a beautiful term, and one that doesn't exist in English. I'm not going to try to pronounce this one, but it's a Hungarian word, which I think is hilarious, which means Donald ducking, which means, wandering around your house with a shirt and no trousers. So you can see they're not always deep or super thoughtful, but I think that's hilarious and shows like who thought of this and how did it become widespread enough for Hungarians to use it. Some other ones that I thought were especially relevant potentially to digital nomads. This French word is someone who spends time but not money in a cafe. We've all been there. There's a Japanese word which means to eat yourself into bankruptcy. Also been there. There's a term for tangled up cables, which is essentially a translation of cable salad. That is the state of my backpack at all times, including backstage right now. And then a Scottish word for the act of hesitating while you're introducing someone because you've forgotten their name. Also very common for, I think, many people in this room. Then there's a couple words that I think are really special because I put origin story there, but what I mean by that is when you hear the word or the definition, you can almost guess where that word might be from. It really represents the culture in a unique way. So for example, there's a Norwegian word that means free air life, which basically means the appreciation of the positive impact of nature. There's a Swedish word which literally means getting up at dawn to listen to the birds sing. I think that's so beautiful, and also I do wonder whether the Swedes do this more now that they have a term to actually associate with it. And then similarly, the Danish actually have a word that means work happiness, which I think is just an amazing term that many people don't actually get to experience in life. And having a term to actually articulate, I do again wonder whether that influences the way Danish people see their jobs and their professions. And then finally, ikigai is a reason for being. I think many of you have seen that kind of like 4x4 Venn diagram. I think also a really interesting Japanese word, which is the intersection of what you're good at, what you love, what you can get paid for, and what the world needs. So those are some really interesting words, and again, I feel like they tie into this origin story. And so I took Unoya and was like, okay, so what do I do with these 500 words? And I started adding tags to them. So different tags like love or nature or beauty, and this is certainly not scientific because I just did this on my own and it was pretty subjective, but I started to see certain patterns. So for example, you can see most languages do have some sort of intricate word for love, some special untranslatable word. Certain languages over-index on nature, certain ones have more over-indexing on negative terms versus positive terms. This is again not scientific and there's nothing huge to take away from here, but I kind of got down this path of thinking, well, if there's trends in the data, what does this mean? Why are there trends? Why are certain languages over-indexing in certain places? What does this mean about how language can actually impact the way we think or our perception? And so on that note, there's over 7,000 languages in the world. Many of us know 1 or 2 or 3, but they completely differ in conjugation, vocabulary, the speed at which people talk, sentence structure, but the one very similar thing across every language is that you learn it before you walk. People learn how to communicate before they even walk. It is such a fundamental aspect of the way we communicate and the way that we participate in society. But many people think of language as a tool, a one-way tool to communicate your experience, but don't consider that it may actually be a dual interaction, where basically language is not just a tool, but it's also a filter on your perception and way of contributing to the world, the way you think, the way you make decisions, the habits that you form. And so there's actually a term for this, and it's linguistic relativity. It is debated very frequently. It was originally theorized by a guy named Edward Sapir in 1929, so way back. And then it was furthered by a guy named Benjamin Whorf. And so it's again this idea that language is not just a tool, but it's a filter, it's a map, and it shapes actually how you experience the world. And so let's take an even further step back and think about what are words in this space of language. Words are symbols, really. They're symbols for us to codify our experience. So we all have experiences. We can't literally download our experiences and upload into others' brains yet, but what words do is allow us to communicate those experiences and hopefully effectively. But when we're codifying this experience, we're never getting to the exact truth. Again, we're codifying it and we don't even notice that we're doing this. So for example, if I say the word hair, you all have a mental image now of hair, and that mental image will actually differ across each person in this audience. And even though I just said one word, I didn't say the protein filament that grows from the follicle on your head, I just said hair. You know what that means. We're codifying experience, but that codification is not always unified across the board. And so I'm going to give a couple examples of how this codification of language impacts, again, the way we think, the way we make decisions, etc. So one example is color. So we as humans are able to see over 1 million colors, or millions of colors, but we normally use only a few or a dozen different words for color. You can see them up there for English. I think Russian is 12 or so. It's generally around that range. But even though we can see so many colors, we only use a few terms. We don't say, 534 nanometers. We don't say RGB XYZ. We're very discrete in the colors that we have available to us. And because of that, we think that's almost like the correct way of representing culture. But interestingly enough, there's people in the world who don't codify color in the exact same way. So some cultures or languages have 5 colors. Some of them have 3. One of them has 2 colors, Mili and Mola, which basically mean warm and cold colors. But the most interesting example that I came across was this example from the Himba tribe. They're from Namibia, and they have 5 colors. And you'll see that the most interesting part of their approach is that their colors don't necessarily align to our separation of colors. So they have a color Sarandu, which is a mixture of different reds and browns and oranges. Dambu is, some greens, a lot of yellows, even some reds and beige. So it really doesn't map out to our traditional way of looking at color. And you can see specifically on the right-hand side that there are, for greens and blues, there's really 3 different buckets that they could fall into for the Himba tribe. And so this is a fun exercise that was a part of this research that was done with this tribe. And so you can see up here there's 2 circles of squares. And in each circle of squares, there's 1 unique square that is a different color from the rest. And for many people, like myself and you guys in the audience, you will immediately see the unique square in the right-hand circle. You'll struggle to see it if you can. I couldn't see it immediately what the unique square is on the left-hand side. But interestingly enough, for the Himba tribe, it was the opposite. They could immediately spot the unique square on the left-hand side and struggle to on the right-hand side. And if we just go back, it's because, so if you look at Buru, a mixture of blues and greens, to them, the right-hand circle was Buru. The whole circle was Buru. And for them, Dambu, there was 1 Dambu square on the left-hand side. And for those of you still wondering, it is in the same place as the blue square in that circle. And so you can search this on the internet, you can download it, put it into Photoshop. It is indeed a different RGB, and they were able to pick that out and really, again, struggled with the right-hand side. So you can see how the way we use language actually does impact the way that we see things, or the attention that we put on certain things. Again, another example, time is a social construct. We think that, time, obviously, it's past, present, and future, but it doesn't have to be, and it's not in some cases. So in another Papua New Guinea tribe, the Yumas, they have 8 tenses. So 3 present, 3 past, 2 future. As an example, the way that they codify their present tenses are different types of events or experiences. So completed events, ongoing events, or scheduled events. And you can imagine how this actually impacts the way you think about life. There's not one present tense. There's multiple present tenses. And actually there was some research done by a guy named Keith Chen that showed that different languages that codify the future and the present separately actually show that those people behave more recklessly when it comes to money and health because they're separating those 2 experiences. Another example, which maybe is more familiar to some of you, is from the book Outliers. Basically, Chinese-speaking children were found to be able to count or learn to count more quickly than English-speaking counterparts because of the way their language is structured. So in English, you have 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 is not actually related to 1 or 10 or any of the prior numbers in any systematic way. Whereas in Mandarin, you have 8, 9, 10, and then 11 is 10, 1. It's very relational, it's very thoughtful, and it makes sense to these children as they're learning to count. Their digits are also single syllables, so they're also able to recite strings of numbers more effectively than their English-speaking counterparts, simply because they fit within a shorter time span of your memory. Another example which I find super interesting is certain Australian languages. They codify space differently in their language. So for example, instead of us saying in English, that chair over there, or that person over here, they say that person to the north, or that chair to the south. And so even in complete darkness, they have a keen sense of direction. And so again, you can see how the way that you use language, even unconsciously, can impact how you think and how you interpret things. The final example is this concept of emotional granularity. And so this woman, Lisa Feldman Barrett, she wrote a book called How Emotions Are Made, and she talked about how, as an individual, if you're able to basically differentiate and therefore label an emotion, you are more effectively able to process that emotion. It makes sense. But in a lot of languages, there aren't necessarily all the words that you would want to label certain emotions. And so one of the ways that I've been thinking about the beauty of untranslatables is that these cultures are offering us different ways of labeling things that we maybe will experience, maybe won't. But for example, many people encounter anxiety I think everyone in this room has encountered anxiety, but often when you encounter anxiety, you're not quite sure what you're anxious about. You just know you're anxious. But maybe if you know that you're really just anxious because you're running out of time to achieve life's goals, you can label that with this German word. Maybe if you're worried or anxious that basically everything's already been done, like why am I doing this? There's a word for that as well. And so the final example there is a sadness where basically you're just upset that you're going to die and you aren't going to know how the rest of history or the world will turn out. There's a word for that too. And so I think it's really interesting to just be able to quantify or codify these experiences that seem very vague and confusing. And there isn't going to be an untranslatable word for everything, but it does add this additional dimension for you to start thinking about what you're experiencing. And so what's the key takeaway of this talk? I think it's about translating the untranslatables. It's this concept that I think untranslatable words give us access to this new world, this new way of experiencing things, and there aren't necessarily one reality that we need to tether ourselves to. So for example, there doesn't need to be one mustache, there doesn't need to be one present tense. Those are just arbitrary examples, but I think untranslatable words gives us access to thinking about these different windows into the behaviors of other people, the thoughts of other cultures, and I think in doing that, if we really process it, we also start to learn about maybe what biases or what preconceptions we've formed based on our own approach to language or what we are basically using to communicate with the rest of the world. So an example of this is we think about work, again, this concept of work. There aren't many positive terms in the English language for work. In Japanese, there's the far end of the spectrum where you have a term called karoshi, which is literally overwork death. It's actually a huge phenomenon in Japan, which people are dying at their desks, and there's charities for it, and it's kind of like an epidemic. But on the other hand, as I mentioned in Danish, you have this concept of work happiness, which is part of their language, is part of their way of communicating with each other. You can see these two extremes that exist in different cultures. It's obviously not a dichotomy, it's not black and white, but it's interesting to think about how these different words can be so far-fetched in different languages, and then there's languages like English that don't really have anything on either spectrum. And then you have something like ikigai, which is this even more dynamic approach to thinking about how you approach your life and what you think is important and how those overlap with one another. So I think it's interesting to start thinking about how these untranslatables, as you explore them, hopefully, you start to think differently about what's available to you. And the final thing is I wanted to share one of my favorite untranslatable words or terms, and it's ichigo ichii. It's a Japanese term. It basically means one time, one meeting. I think it's really beautiful. It's this concept that no matter whether you bring the same people together in the same location, life really isn't repeatable. And that may be depressing in some cases, but it's also really beautiful when you just realize that every moment is a once-in-a-lifetime experience, even if it's not an extreme moment. This conference, for example, there will be year 5 and 6 and 7, but we're here for year 4, and this isn't repeatable. And so to enjoy it while it lasts, I think it's a really interesting and also beautiful term to kind of incorporate into your life. Something doesn't have to be incredible for it to be a once-in-a-lifetime experience. So this is another example of, I think, just a really great word that we don't have in English, and I don't think exists in many languages, but you can incorporate it, you can download it, and kind of add it to your reality. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Steph. I freaking loved all of this. Also, your cartoon is adorable. So, final Q&A of the day. Get your questions ready. My question is, have you found yourself using any of these terms in like everyday life with other English speakers, and have they caught on?
So I haven't found myself using as many of the words specifically, partially because I think I'm horrible at pronouncing them, and I also feel like when you use words that maybe other people aren't as privy to, you kind of sound like a douche. You're like, oh, have you heard of this concept? But I think what's really interesting is when you are able to kind of like conceptualize the concepts, right? And so I do find myself using some of these concepts in the way I think about things, the way I think about my goals, how I interpret like my days, and so I think that's more important. It's not necessarily being able to use a specific word and sound super cool. It's more about understanding, again, like these like other realities that exist and like how you can think about them.
Yeah, I love that. All right, questions. All right, we'll start with Jules and then Sonia.
Hi.
Hi.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your data exploration process for the spreadsheet slide where you kind of got into the different themes and how you like came up with the idea for that, how you tackled that. I don't know how familiar you are with a bunch of different languages, so if you'd like seen it and then we're like, how do I sort of explore that across a lot more?
Yeah, so like I said, the initial database and most of what exists now was mostly crowdsourced. So I would have the word, the definition, and then even from the get-go, I was tagging them with things that just so people could search them. If you go onto the website, it's unoia.world. You can search by language, you can search by tag, you can search for a specific word. So I was doing that from the get-go. But I love data. I wrote an article once about like an ode to Excel. So it was natural for me to basically be like, okay, I want to know like more, right? Because again, you look at one single word and you learn something, but it's hard to kind of get a sense of like, what does this mean on a larger scale? And I still don't think what I did really has many clear takeaways. The data set's not big enough. It was pretty arbitrary again, but I just started to look at, I wanted to know if I look at a bunch of Japanese words, like what can I learn? What's the like download or what's the story there, right, for Japanese words or German words or whatever language. And some of the languages only have, like a few words, but some of them, like the languages I just mentioned, they have like a couple dozen. So that was like kind of the impetus of like me wanting to do that. And then, yeah, I just pulled it into a spreadsheet and started analyzing it.
Sonia, can we get Sonia a mic?
Yeah, I would like to add to that and ask, do you know whether the people who helped you with the crowdsourcing, whether they were actually native speakers? Because I have a specific question about the Seigneur Terrasse, the one that we all love the idea, but we are two French people here and we've never heard of it.
Really?
And I just did a quick search on the internet, and it basically only comes up in English-speaking, untranslatable blog posts kind of things. But I tried to find something in French right now, and the only thing that comes up is like, does anyone know this word? I don't know exactly what it is. I think this is
It's
something
very
that people
possible.
can-
Like I said, some of the words were crowdsourced, especially the earlier ones. And so I didn't do the due diligence on the very first download, so I should probably check that. But I think it's a cool word. We can
Sure
start
is.
using it.
And
Yeah.
I'm sure it will catch on, and French people will start using it soon.
Sounds like a match.
Yeah, I want second part is you talked about how to incorporate that into your thinking and your and maybe also your language, but like as someone, I grew up with two languages, for example, and both French and German have both different untranslatable words. And I mean, you did a really good job at explaining those things, but I think a lot of those things are actually so much more than what someone else can actually understand when you try to explain them.
Of course, yeah.
You know, and how, so probably what you will try to incorporate into your thinking, which is probably still a great idea to do, will still be very different from the native speaker knowledge of like that feeling behind the word or behind the concept or behind how to explain it. So yeah, I was just curious about.
No, and I've talked to people about this, and you're completely right. A lot of people, even when they're trying to come up with a definition for the untranslatable word, they're like, it's this, but it's not really that. It's untranslatable. It's not like I can't really codify it into it's an experience, right? It evokes some sort of emotion. So absolutely, I don't think I'll ever be able to fully understand like the concepts that are from your native tongue, especially because I only know one native tongue, so everything is kind of filtered again under the perception of the tongue that I speak. But I do think it's interesting. You get, let's say a native speaker will get 100% of the value of that word. I still think a non-native speaker can get maybe 70% of the value, to just kind of understand how others might be thinking.
So you're saying we can't all learn to see that color green.
Yeah, exactly.
I think John had a question, and then Hillary.
I don't know if this is answerable. I just wondered if there's a reason why, for example, German and Japanese have these really specific concepts. It's really fascinating to me that you get these kind of quite unusual ideas summarized in one word. Is there a cultural reason for that? I don't know if that's...
I don't know if there's any sort of term. I haven't run into it, but I've thought about this too, and I think Japanese especially, there's just so many untranslatable words that are so kind of foreign in concept. But I think it's a function of that it being such a unique culture. Again, that comes from a frequency of unique experiences that don't exist elsewhere. And I think, admittedly, English culture is not that unique, and that's why you don't have as many untranslatable words from English. But I think it's because of that. I don't know if there's actually some more distinct concept that explains that. But Japanese was one of the reasons that I wanted to create this, because I just thought, like, even just running to 4 or 5 of those words, you're kind of like, wow, like, this culture is so interesting and so much more dynamic than other cultures potentially, right? So that was the impetus for me wanting to like dig in more deeply, but I don't know if there's any sort of like theory around it.
I believe the answer to at least what I was told in Japan is that's basically it's part of the, you've probably heard of the Galapagos syndrome thing about Japan, of how basically they developed so many things in a different way because of the island phenomenon and being so isolated, and so they had technology that was completely different and parallel to what developed in other parts of the world. And that's also why the language might be so much more specific, because they had less exchange with other cultures and languages where you have to agree on, where you have to understand each other, so you find something that both can understand.
And you asked about theories on that. So that's right. So they're called lone states. So Ethiopia, Japan and Israel are considered lone states because they not share as much cultural overlap with other countries than they do. And there's a number of range and cultural studies, including clash of civilizations and so forth, where this is elaborated. And it's also, of course, always depending on your standpoint. So from the perspective of the German, it's not that the Germans have so many strange concepts, it's that the English have so many strange concepts.
But then also that you have so many things you don't have. You're missing out on so many things, and I don't understand why.
All right, Germans, you're going to host a breakout session tomorrow on your words. Hillary has the last question of the day.
Thanks for your talk. So I got the impression, and I might just be projecting here, that a lot of these words are older words. Were you finding any that were kind of more modern, like because of, say, technology or things like that, that there's starting to be untranslatable words that...
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, translate.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. And I actually started to create like a spreadsheet of some of these words because I felt like it was almost like Urban Dictionary-esque without like all dirty words. It's more like just words that, again, are popping up in certain places. They're more modern for similar reasons. Like it's like a quantification of experience in that particular place. But I wasn't really sure if they fit within this site or database, because they are more traditional words that have been around in those languages, minus the example that she pointed out. No, but yeah, I've been thinking about that as well. So I've been thinking about how I might want to extend the site, potentially, but super busy. I have a full-time job.
Yes, we don't want to burn you out.
Yeah, but anyway, it's a great point. I didn't include it in this iteration, but something I'm thinking about.
Awesome. Well, I think we all look forward to reading more about that. Everyone give Steph a huge round of applause.